The first thing you notice isn't the water, it's the smell. Thick, sour, unmistakable, like something deep underground finally decided it had enough and came looking for air. It hit me the moment I stepped out of my truck, boots crunching against the fresh asphalt that hadn't even fully cured yet, the morning heat already pulling that stench up into the neighborhood like a warning nobody understood. By the time the first manhole cover rattled, I already knew exactly what was about to happen. 3 weeks earlier, I had stood in this exact spot, watching a crew pour concrete over a section of land I could have mapped blindfolded, land that carried a system my father and I had maintained for over 20 years, a buried network of pipes, tanks, and pressure lines that didn't forgive ignorance. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm a civil engineer, and everything under this subdivision used to make sense to me before the HOA decided they knew better than the ground beneath their feet. I grew up on this property, learned how to read soil composition before I could drive, learned how water moves, how waste moves, how pressure builds quietly until it doesn't. My dad used to say systems don't fail suddenly. They fail exactly the way they were designed to when someone interrupts the balance. That memory sat heavy in my chest the day Margaret Whitmore rolled up in her white Lexus, heels clicking on gravel like she owned not just the land but the laws of physics too, smiling that polished HOA smile while she pointed at my back acreage and called it underutilized potential. She talked about community upgrades, about increasing property value, about bringing everything up to standard. And I remember the faint scent of her perfume trying to overpower the diesel fumes from the construction equipment behind her, like presentation could somehow replace understanding. I told her there was a septic main line running straight through that section, told her it wasn't just mine. It fed into a shared pressure system that had limits you don't test unless you're ready for consequences. But she didn't hear a word of it, just handed me paperwork, permits stamped and approved, signatures from people who had never once set foot on this soil. The sound of rebar clanging and cement mixers turning drowned out everything else, including common sense, and within days they had sealed access points, buried inspection caps, and redirected flow without ever realizing what they had done. I tried once more, laid out diagrams, explained load thresholds, backflow risk, how one blocked line could reverse everything upstream. But all I got back was a violation notice taped to my mailbox and a reminder that unauthorized interference with community development would result in fines. That's when I stopped arguing. Because the truth is, you don't fight a system like this head on. You let it breathe. You let it build. You let it do exactly what it was always going to do. And now, standing here as that first metallic groan echoed beneath the street and a dark ripple pushed up through the manhole cover, I could feel the pressure finally reaching its breaking point. The ground wasn't failing. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way it was designed to. And Margaret Whitmore had just built her entire neighborhood on top of it. The land used to breathe differently before the asphalt sealed it in, before the straight lines and perfect curves replaced the uneven rhythm of soil and grass that I had known my entire life. I can still remember the way the ground felt under my boots when I was 10 years old, soft in the mornings, firm by noon, carrying that faint scent of damp earth mixed with engine oil from my father's old pickup parked near the tank lids. Back then, the system was not just pipes and measurements. It was routine, it was discipline, it was understanding something most people never even thought about. My father, Thomas Caldwell, never called it infrastructure. He called it responsibility. He would wake me up before sunrise, hand me a wrench that felt too heavy for my hands, and walk me out to the access points spaced across the property like quiet checkpoints. He taught me how to listen, not just hear, but listen for changes in flow, the low gurgle that meant everything was moving correctly, the subtle shift in pressure that told you something. Upstream had changed. He used to crouch beside the inspection cap, tap it lightly with his knuckle, and say the system always talks, you just have to know its language. By the time I was in high school, I could trace every line in my head, knew exactly how far each pipe ran, where the slope changed, where the pressure built before release, and more importantly, where it could not be blocked without consequences. That land was not just property to us. It was a living system we maintained, something that had outlasted storms, droughts, and careless contractors who thought shortcuts were harmless. When my father passed, the deed transferred to me. But more than that, the responsibility transferred with it. Every valve, every junction, every buried segment that no blueprint could fully capture. I left for college, studied civil engineering, worked on municipal systems in cities where millions depended on networks 10 times larger, but none of them ever felt as precise or as personal as the one beneath my own land. When I came back, I did not see empty acreage the way developers did. I saw load capacity, I saw flow direction, I saw a system that had been working quietly for decades because it had been respected. That is why when Margaret stood there describing expansion plans and community improvements, I could already feel where the problem would start, not emotionally, but structurally. She saw square footage and resale value. I saw choke points and pressure thresholds. She talked about new foundations and paved access roads, and all I could picture was weight distribution pressing down on lines that were never designed to carry that kind of load. I tried to explain it in plain terms, told her that septic systems are not optional infrastructure. They are dependent networks that require access, airflow, and balance, but she reduced it to a checkbox on a permit form, something that could be approved and forgotten. What she never understood is that systems like this do not forget. They adjust, they compensate, and when they are pushed beyond their limits, they respond in ways that are not immediate but are always inevitable. Standing there now, watching that neighborhood unfold on top of something she never took the time to understand, I realized this was never about a disagreement over land. It was about someone deciding that control on paper mattered more than reality underground. And reality, unlike paperwork, does not negotiate. Margaret Whitmore did not arrive like a storm. She arrived like policy, polished and controlled, the kind of presence that did not raise its voice because it never had to. The first time I saw her up close, she stepped out of that white Lexus with a kind of practiced precision, heels clicking against the gravel like she was already measuring the space, already deciding what belonged and what needed to change. Her blazer was perfectly fitted despite the Texas heat, her hair pulled back in a way that did not move even when the wind picked up dust around us. And there was always that faint scent of expensive perfume that tried to overwrite everything else: diesel, dirt, even the natural smell of the land itself. She carried a clipboard, not because she needed it, but because it symbolized something: authority without question, decisions without discussion. People like Margaret do not see themselves as villains. They see themselves as necessary, as the ones who bring order to what they consider unfinished or unrefined. To her, this land was not a system. It was a blank canvas that had simply been waiting for someone with the right vision to correct it. She introduced herself with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, her voice smooth and steady, the kind of tone that sounded reasonable even when what she was saying made no sense at all. She talked about growth, about modernization, about bringing the surrounding properties into alignment with what she called community expectations, and every word felt like it had been rehearsed in a boardroom rather than spoken on soil that had its own rules long before she arrived. I remember watching the way she pointed at different sections of the land without ever asking what was underneath, how she described future streets and foundations as if the ground would simply accept whatever was placed on top of it. There was a confidence there that did not come from knowledge. It came from paperwork, from approvals stamped by offices miles away, from people who had never crouched down to listen to a pipe or felt pressure building beneath their boots. What made it worse was not just her certainty. It was the way everyone around her seemed to adopt it. The contractors nodded without question, the surveyors adjusted their markers to match her plans, and even the county inspector who showed up for a brief walkthrough spent more time looking at his clipboard than the land itself. Margaret had built a system of her own above ground, one made of influence and assumption, and in her world, that system was enough to override anything beneath it. The first real sign that this was going to become a problem came when her crew started placing stakes directly over one of the main access points, a location I knew down to the inch because my father had made me measure it a dozen times growing up. I walked over, boots sinking slightly into the loose soil, and told the foreman to stop, explained that they were marking a critical line, something that could not be covered or relocated without a full system redesign. He looked at me, then looked past me to Margaret, and I could see the moment he decided whose version of reality mattered more. She did not even step closer, just tilted her head slightly and gave a small nod, and that was enough. The stake went in. That sound, the dull thud of wood being driven into the ground, stuck with me more than anything she said that day because it was the moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision. From that point on, everything moved quickly, too quickly for proper checks, too quickly for anyone to question the foundation they were building on, and every new layer of concrete and asphalt felt less like progress and more like pressure building in a place that had never been designed to hold it. Margaret never raised her voice, never threatened, never argued. She did not need to. She had something far more effective, a belief that authority on paper was stronger than reality beneath the surface. And that belief was about to meet a system that did not recognize authority, only pressure and flow. The day the concrete trucks arrived before sunrise was the day everything shifted from warning to consequence, even if nobody else could feel it yet. I remember the low rumble of engines echoing across the property while the air still held that early morning chill, the kind that usually carried the clean scent of grass and damp soil. But that morning it was already mixing with diesel fumes and hot cement, thick and unnatural, like something was being forced into place too quickly. I stood at the edge of the work zone, watching as they rolled out rebar cages and positioned forms directly over the line I had pointed out days earlier, the exact stretch where the main pressure flow narrowed before branching into secondary lines. It was not just a pipe, it was the control point, the place where everything balanced before continuing outward, and now they were sealing it under 8 inches of reinforced concrete like it was just another patch of ground. I walked over to the foreman again, my boots kicking up small clouds of dust, and I could feel that familiar tension building in my chest, not anger, but the kind of awareness you get when you know a system is being pushed toward failure. I explained it one more time, slower this time, laid out exactly what would happen if that section lost access, how pressure would have nowhere to release properly, how it would not fail immediately but gradually, quietly, until one day it would not hold anymore. He listened, or at least pretended to, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the temporary office trailer where Margaret stood with her arms crossed, watching like a supervisor reviewing progress rather than a decision-maker ignoring a warning. When he finally responded, it was not with understanding, it was with a shrug, a simple gesture that said the plan had already been approved and there was nothing left to discuss. That was the moment I realized I was no longer part of the equation in their minds. To them, I was just the guy who owned adjacent land, not the one who understood the system they were building over. The forms went in, the concrete poured, and I stood there listening to the wet mixture spread and settle, that slow, heavy sound filling the space where airflow used to move freely through access points now being sealed shut. Over the next few days, the changes became more aggressive. They installed drainage grates that tied directly into the same network without recalculating load, rerouted surface runoff into lines that were never designed to carry storm volume, and paved over every inspection cap that had once allowed maintenance and pressure release. Each decision on its own might have seemed small to someone who did not understand how these systems worked, but together they created something dangerous, a closed loop with no margin for error. I tried going through official channels, called the county office, referenced the original permits, even pulled archive diagrams that showed exactly where the infrastructure ran beneath the surface, but every response came back the same way: stamped approvals, updated plans, compliance verified. On paper, everything was correct. In reality, everything was being compressed into a system that could not adapt fast enough to what they were doing. The first time I noticed the subtle change was not visible, it was audible. Late one evening, after the crews had packed up and the neighborhood lights had started to come on, I walked out toward the old access path that no longer existed and stood still, listening. The usual low, steady movement I had grown up hearing was different, tighter, like something was being forced through a space that was no longer sufficient. It was not loud enough for anyone else to notice, but to me it was unmistakable. The system was adjusting, trying to compensate for the new constraints, redistributing pressure in ways it was never designed to handle long-term. I knew then that the timeline had changed. This was no longer about whether it would fail, it was about when. And standing there in the fading light, with the smell of fresh asphalt still lingering in the air, I understood something Margaret never did. You can build over a system, you can ignore it, you can even pretend it does not exist, but you cannot change the way it responds when you push it past its limits. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon. tucked into my mailbox like it carried the same weight as everything else they had already buried under concrete. Thick paper, official letterhead, the kind that tries to sound final before anything has actually been proven. I could smell the faint trace of printer ink as I unfolded it, standing there at the edge of my driveway, while the late summer heat pressed down on everything. The distant hum of lawn sprinklers mixing with the steady, almost imperceptible shift in pressure beneath my feet that I had started to notice more and more each day. Unauthorized interference with community infrastructure. It read, the words precise, detached, as if they had been copied from a template designed to silence rather than inform. There was a fine listed at the bottom, daily penalties if I continued what they described as disruptive claims, and a warning that further action could be taken if I did not comply. I remember letting out a slow breath, not out of frustration, but because that was the moment I understood exactly how they saw this situation. To them, I was the problem, not the buried access points, not the sealed lines, not the increasing load being forced into a system that had never been recalibrated, but me, the one person pointing at it. I walked back inside, set the letter on the kitchen table, and for a few minutes I just stood there, listening to the quiet of the house, the faint tick of the wall clock, the low hum of the refrigerator, normal sounds that contrasted with the tension building outside where everything looked perfect on the surface. That contrast is what systems rely on, the illusion of stability while pressure builds somewhere unseen. I decided to try one more time, not because I expected a different outcome, but because I needed it documented. I scheduled a meeting with the county office, brought copies of the original permits, the hand-drawn diagrams my father had preserved, and the updated flow calculations I had run myself based on their new construction layout. Sitting across from a man who never once looked away from his computer screen, I explained it all again, how the system was designed, where the choke point existed, what would happen if access remained sealed and load continued to increase. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw hesitation in his expression. But then he clicked something, glanced at the digital file in front of him, and said the words I had already come to expect. All modifications have been approved under current development guidelines. That was it. No inspection request, no reconsideration, just approval based on paperwork that did not reflect reality. When I left that office, the air outside felt heavier, not physically, but in a way that made it clear there was no institutional correction coming, no authority stepping in to align things with how they actually worked. Over the next week, the notices escalated. Another letter, then a warning posted near my property line, language becoming sharper, more insistent, as if repetition could turn their assumption into fact. I drove past the subdivision one evening and saw families walking along those freshly paved streets, kids riding bikes over the exact section where the main line now sat under layers of concrete. Everything looking clean, orderly, controlled. Margaret stood near the entrance talking with a small group of residents, her posture relaxed, confident, like someone who had already moved on from a problem she believed was resolved. She glanced in my direction for a brief second, just long enough for me to see that same composed expression, not hostile, not concerned, just certain. That certainty was what made it clear this was no longer a disagreement that could be argued away. I had done everything the conventional way, explained, documented, reported, and each step had been dismissed because it did not fit within their version of control. That night, I walked the perimeter of my land again, stopping where the original access point used to be, now hidden beneath a smooth layer of pavement that reflected the fading light of the evening sky. I crouched down, pressed my hand against the surface, and felt the faintest vibration, subtle but consistent, like something moving through a space that had become too tight. That was the moment I stopped, trying to convince anyone, because the system did not need approval to respond. It just needed time. The change did not come all at once. It never does. It came in small signs that only meant something if you knew where to look, or more importantly, where to listen. A week after the last notice showed up on my door, I started noticing the timing shift, not in anything visible, but in the way the system moved beneath everything they had built. Early mornings used to be quiet, low usage, steady flow, but now there was a delay, a hesitation in the movement that felt like pressure waiting for permission to go somewhere it no longer could. I would stand near the old boundary line just after sunrise, coffee cooling in my hand, listening to that faint internal strain, like a breath being held too long. It was subtle, something no homeowner walking their dog or backing out of a driveway would ever notice, but to me it was unmistakable. The system was no longer balanced. It was compensating. That is the word most people do not understand. Compensation is not stability, it is temporary survival. I went back through my old notes, the measurements my father and I had taken years ago, the slope ratios, the pipe diameters, the capacity limits that had always been respected until now. I ran the numbers again with the new load factored in. Every new house, every added drainage connection, every redirected runoff line they had tied into a system that had never been upgraded to handle it. The result was not dramatic on paper, just a gradual increase, a narrowing margin. But systems do not fail on paper. They fail in reality when that margin disappears. One evening, after a light rain that barely registered as weather, I heard it more clearly than before. A deeper tone in the flow, slower, heavier, like something was being pushed uphill instead of moving freely downhill the way it was designed. I followed the sound as far as I could without access, stopping where the pavement now sealed what used to be the primary inspection point. I knelt down again, pressing my palm against the surface, and this time the vibration was stronger, more defined, like the system was no longer just adjusting, it was resisting. That was the first moment I understood the timeline had accelerated. They had not just increased the load, they had altered the behavior of the entire network. The next day, I drove past the subdivision in the afternoon heat, windows down, letting the air carry whatever it would. At first, everything looked the same, clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, the quiet hum of suburban life. But then I caught it, faint, almost hidden beneath the smell of fresh mulch and cut grass, a sour undertone that should not have been there at all. It was not strong enough for anyone to react to, not yet, but it was there, the first sign that pressure was no longer contained where it was supposed to be. I watched as a maintenance crew checked one of the new surface drains, lifting the grate briefly before setting it back in place, their movements casual, unaware, because from their perspective everything was functioning. And technically it was. That is the part people misunderstand. A system can still function while it is failing. It can move, it can carry load, it can appear stable right up until the moment it reaches a point where it cannot compensate anymore. Later that evening, I sat at my desk, diagrams spread out in front of me, tracing the lines again, not looking for a way to stop it, but confirming what I already knew. There was no fix coming from outside, no intervention that would reopen what had been sealed or reduce the load they had already committed to. The only thing left was time and conditions. I did not need to create anything. I did not need to interfere, because the system had already been pushed into a state where it would respond on its own. And when it did, it would not be sudden or explosive. It would be methodical, the result of pressure building exactly where it had nowhere left to go. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet of the room settling around me, and for the first time since this started, I felt something close to certainty. Not about what might happen, but about what would. The realization did not come from anything dramatic. It came from a quiet inconsistency, the kind that only stands out when you have spent years watching something behave the same way every single day. It happened on a late afternoon after another light rain, nothing more than a quarter inch, the kind that usually disappears into the system without a trace, absorbed, processed, carried away exactly as designed. I was parked just outside the subdivision, engine off, windows down, letting the still air carry whatever it would. And that is when I noticed it, not the smell this time, but the delay. Water pooled along the curb longer than it should have, thin reflective sheets stretching across the asphalt before slowly disappearing, not draining cleanly, not moving with the efficiency I knew it once had. That hesitation was not random, it was structural. I stepped out, the heat from the pavement rising through the soles of my boots, and walked along the edge of the street, watching how the runoff gathered near the new drainage grates they had installed. The design looked correct on the surface, evenly spaced, properly angled, but the flow into them was sluggish, like the system underneath was no longer pulling, only receiving. That is when it clicked. The system was not just overloaded, it had been inverted in behavior. It was no longer controlling the flow, it was reacting to it. I followed the line of drains as far as I could, mapping it in my head, connecting what I could see above ground with what I knew existed below, and then I reached the section where the main line crossed under the road. The same section now sealed beneath reinforced concrete. I stopped there, looking down at nothing but smooth pavement, and for a moment I could almost hear my father's voice, calm, certain, explaining that every system has a point where control is maintained, and if that point is compromised, everything upstream loses direction. That was the missing piece. They had not just increased load or blocked access, they had eliminated the control point entirely. Without it, the system was no longer regulating pressure, it was storing it. I crouched down again, placing my hand flat against the ground, and this time the vibration was different, not just stronger, but irregular, pulses instead of steady movement, like the system was searching for release points that no longer existed where they should. That is when the full picture came into focus. Every home in that subdivision, every sink, every shower, every load of laundry, every bit of water they sent into that network was feeding into a system that no longer had its original balance. And more importantly, every surface drain they had added was pushing storm runoff into the same constrained space. It was not just a septic system anymore. It was a closed pressure network with no proper outlet during peak conditions. I stood up slowly, scanning the neighborhood, watching as a car rolled by, tires hissing lightly over damp pavement, completely unaware of what was building beneath it. That was the moment the uncertainty disappeared. Up until then, I knew something would happen, but now I knew how it would happen. It would not start underground where nobody could see it. It would surface where the system found the weakest available exit point. And in a design like this, that meant the lowest accessible openings, street-level drains, manhole covers, anywhere pressure could force its way back into the open. I walked back to my truck, the faint sour note in the air just barely noticeable again, and sat there for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the realization settle in. I had spent weeks trying to explain this in words, diagrams, calculations, but the truth was it was never something they were going to understand that way. Because understanding requires respect for the system, and they had already proven they did not have that. I started the engine, the low vibration grounding me back in the present, and pulled away slowly, leaving the neighborhood exactly as it was, calm, orderly, unaware. But in my mind, the sequence was already clear. Pressure would build, compensation would fail, and when it did, the system would not ask for permission. It would simply take the path that was left open to it. I went back to the records that night, not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted precision. There is a difference between knowing something will fail and knowing exactly how it will fail, and in systems like this, that difference matters. I pulled out the original county filings, the ones my father had kept in a weathered binder that still smelled faintly of dust and machine oil, pages marked with handwritten notes, measurements taken long before any of this new construction existed. I laid them out across the table, then opened my laptop beside them, overlaying the old diagrams with the updated development plans that Margaret's HOA had pushed through. On paper, everything looked clean, organized, approved, but when you aligned the two realities, the truth was impossible to ignore. The main septic line was never relocated, never reinforced, never recalculated. It was simply built over, as if covering it somehow changed what it was doing underneath. I ran the flow calculations again, this time not just for average usage, but for peak conditions, heavy rainfall combined with full residential load, every house active, every drain feeding into a system that no longer had a functional control point. The numbers did not spike dramatically. They did something worse. They compressed. The margin for error dropped to almost nothing, meaning the system would hold, and then fail all at once when even a small increase pushed it past its limit. That is the kind of failure people never see coming, because everything appears stable right up until it is not. I traced the path again, starting from the far end of the subdivision, following every line back to the buried section beneath that reinforced slab, and then forward to the nearest surface outlets, the storm drains, the manholes, the places designed to release pressure when everything else is functioning correctly. Except now, those outlets were no longer secondary. They had become the only available exit points under stress. I leaned back in my chair, the soft hum of the ceiling fan above me blending with the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, and for a moment I just let the pattern settle into place. This was not chaos. It was structure, predictable, repeatable, inevitable. The next morning, I drove out before sunrise, parking at the edge of my property where the original access path used to be. The air was cooler, carrying that faint, sour undertone that had started appearing more frequently, still subtle, still ignorable if you were not paying attention, but to me it was like a signal growing stronger. I walked the line slowly, stopping at each point where I knew something critical had once existed, each now hidden beneath concrete, landscaping, or decorative features that meant nothing to the system they had disrupted. At one of the newer storm drains, I noticed something small but important. A thin residue along the inner edge of the grate, darker than it should have been, not fresh, not obvious, but out of place. I crouched down, studying it closer, and could see where water had sat longer than intended, where flow had hesitated before finally moving through. That hesitation was leaving a trace, and traces mean repetition. This was not a one-time fluctuation, it was a pattern forming. I stood up, scanning the street as the first lights in the houses flicked on, people starting their day, unaware of what their normal routines were feeding into. Coffee makers, showers, washing machines, all of it entering a system that no longer distributed load the way it was designed to. I did not feel urgency, not in the way most people think of it. There was no panic, no rush to act, because there was nothing left to fix manually. The conditions were already set. The system was already responding. The only variable left was timing. I walked back to my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots, and paused for a moment before opening the door, looking back at the subdivision now bathed in early morning light, quiet, controlled, perfectly maintained on the surface. It looked exactly the way Margaret wanted it to look. And that was the final piece of it. Because systems do not care how things look. They respond to what is real. And what was real beneath that neighborhood was a network that had been pushed into a state where it could no longer release pressure the way it was designed to. It would find another way. It always does. The first person who noticed something was wrong did not understand what they were seeing, and that is usually how it begins. I was parked across the street that morning, engine off, watching the neighborhood settle into its routine when a maintenance worker pulled up beside one of the storm drains near the entrance. He stepped out slowly, lifting the metal grate just enough to peek inside, and I could tell by the way he paused that something was not moving the way it should. There was no panic, no urgency, just confusion, the kind that comes when a system gives you a result you were not trained to expect. He set the grate back down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked around as if the answer might be somewhere above ground, where everything still looked perfect. I had seen that exact moment before in other projects, that quiet disconnect between appearance and reality, and it told me everything I needed to know. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was visible. Over the next few days, those small signs multiplied. Water lingered longer after even minor use. The faint sour smell became just noticeable enough that people started reacting to it without fully understanding why, subtle enough to ignore, but persistent enough to return. I watched as a homeowner stepped out onto her driveway, wrinkling her nose slightly before shaking it off and going back inside, dismissing it as something temporary, something that would pass on its own. That is how most people interact with systems. They assume stability is permanent because they have never seen what happens when it is not. I kept my distance, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing I needed to change. Everything that was happening now was the system adjusting to the constraints it had been forced into, redistributing pressure in smaller cycles before the larger release that I knew was coming. I spent that afternoon reviewing everything one more time, not because I doubted the outcome, but because I wanted to understand the sequence with complete clarity. The rainfall forecast showed a heavier system moving in within the next week, nothing extreme, just enough to add additional load to a network that was already operating beyond its intended capacity. Combined with normal residential use, it would be the kind of condition that pushed the system from compensation into overflow. I traced the path again, visualizing how each section would respond, where the pressure would build first, where it would search for release, and where it would finally find it. It was not random. It never is. Systems fail along predictable paths, and in this case, those paths led directly to the lowest accessible outlets within the subdivision itself. That evening, I drove past the entrance again, slower this time, watching as Margaret stood near the community sign, speaking with two residents, her posture as composed as ever, her expression calm, controlled, unchanged. Whatever concerns had started to surface had not reached her in any meaningful way, or if they had, she had already decided they were manageable, minor issues that could be handled through the same structure of authority she relied on for everything else. She did not look at the ground, did not listen for anything beneath it, because in her world, problems existed only when they were acknowledged in reports or complaints, not when they were forming silently out of sight. I passed by without stopping, the faint odor in the air now stronger than it had been the day before, no longer just a trace, but still not enough to cause alarm. Not yet. That is the nature of pressure systems. They give warnings in increments, small deviations that build into patterns, patterns that build into inevitability. Most people ignore the early stages because nothing appears broken. But I knew better. I had seen the pattern complete itself before. And as I turned onto the main road, leaving the subdivision behind me, I realized something else had changed. I was no longer waiting to see if it would happen. I was waiting to see exactly when. The forecast came in just after sunset, a slow-moving system pushing in from the west, nothing severe, no warnings, just steady rain expected over the next 24 hours, the kind most people barely pay attention to, the kind that quietly changes conditions without announcing itself. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I saw it, the soft glow of the screen reflecting off the old diagrams still spread out in front of me, and I remember thinking how ordinary it looked on paper, a few inches of rain, evenly distributed, nothing dramatic. But that is exactly what made it significant. Systems like this do not need extremes to fail, they need consistency, sustained input that removes any chance for recovery. I drove out that night before the first drops started falling, parking at the edge of the subdivision with the headlights off, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light from porch lamps and streetlights reflecting off clean pavement. The air felt heavier, humid, carrying that faint sour note more clearly now, not strong, but present enough that it no longer blended into the background. I stepped out, the gravel shifting under my boots, and listened. The low movement beneath the ground had changed again, deeper, slower, like something was filling space that used to be empty. That was the key difference. The system was no longer just moving flow, it was storing it. I walked along the street, passing over the sections where I knew the lines ran closest to the surface, and with each step I could feel that subtle resistance, not through vibration this time, but through the absence of it. Movement was becoming restricted. When I reached the main intersection near the center of the subdivision, I stopped and looked at the storm drains positioned along the curb, evenly spaced, designed to handle runoff efficiently, but now acting as the only available release points for something much more complex than surface water. I crouched beside one, running my fingers along the edge of the grate, feeling the dampness that had already started to collect despite no rainfall yet, a sign that internal pressure was pushing moisture back toward the surface. That should not have been happening. Not at all. I stood up slowly, glancing toward the rows of houses, windows glowing softly, televisions flickering behind curtains, people moving through their routines without any awareness of what was building beneath them. I could see Margaret's house from there, larger than the rest, lights on, perfectly maintained landscaping framing the front yard like a display of control and order. Nothing about it suggested vulnerability. Nothing about it suggested that the system supporting it had already shifted beyond what it could handle. The first drops started falling just as I got back into my truck, light at first, tapping against the windshield in a steady rhythm that most people would find calming. I sat there for a moment, watching the water begin to collect along the edges of the street, thin streams forming and moving toward the drains, disappearing below the surface exactly as they were supposed to. But I knew that was temporary. The system was already at capacity before the rain even began. This was not about absorption anymore. It was about accumulation. As the rain picked up, the sound changed, from light tapping to a steady hiss against the pavement, water flowing faster now, feeding into a network that had nowhere left to direct it properly. I started the engine but did not drive away immediately. Instead, I watched, because this was the point where preparation ended and response began. Not mine, the system's. Everything that had been done, every decision, every layer of concrete, every ignored warning, had led to this exact moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, just inevitable. I pulled away slowly as the rain continued to fall, leaving the subdivision behind me once again, But this time, there was no uncertainty left. The conditions were set. The load was increasing. And the system, for the first time since all of this started, had no more room to adjust. The rain did not rush. It settled in, steady and patient, the kind of rainfall that does not overwhelm immediately but builds weight over time, every drop adding to a system that had already run out of space to absorb it. By midnight, the sound had changed from a soft hiss to a constant, layered rhythm, water striking rooftops, flowing down gutters, collecting along curbs, feeding into drains that were already working beyond their intended capacity. I drove back out just after 1 in the morning, headlights cutting through the thin curtain of rain, the streets glistening under streetlights that reflected off the growing sheen of water. At first glance, everything still looked controlled, the water moving where it was supposed to, disappearing into the grates. But I could see the difference in the details, the speed, the hesitation, the way the flow no longer pulled cleanly downward but lingered just a fraction longer before being forced through. I parked near the center of the subdivision and stepped out, the rain soaking through my jacket within seconds, the air thick with that now unmistakable sour undertone that had grown stronger with each passing hour. I walked toward the nearest storm drain, watching as water funneled into it faster than before, the edges beginning to ripple in a way that did not belong to simple runoff. That ripple was pressure pushing back. I crouched down, close enough to hear it now, a low, uneven gurgle beneath the steady rain, like something struggling to move through a space that had become too restricted. That was the sound I had been waiting for, not loud, not dramatic, but definitive. The system had reached its threshold. I stood up and scanned the street, and this time the changes were no longer subtle. Water was beginning to collect in shallow pools where it should have cleared immediately, thin sheets spreading wider across the pavement, reflecting the overhead lights in distorted patterns. A car passed slowly, tires cutting through the water with a soft hiss, leaving behind ripples that did not settle as quickly as they should have. That delay meant everything. The system was no longer clearing input at the rate it was receiving it. It was falling behind. I walked further down the street, each step confirming what I already knew. The smell stronger now, no longer something that could be dismissed, but not yet overwhelming, just present enough to signal what was moving beneath the surface. Then it happened, not with a burst, not with any sudden force, but with a shift. The nearest manhole cover let out a dull metallic sound, a brief, heavy vibration that traveled through the ground and into the soles of my boots. The water around it trembled, then stilled, then began to move differently, not just flowing toward it, but reacting to it. That was the moment the system stopped compensating. It had nowhere left to push forward, so it began to push back. I took a step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding, watching as the water at the edges of the street changed direction in small, almost unnoticeable ways, currents colliding instead of aligning, pressure redistributing toward the lowest available openings. A porch light flicked on down the block, a door opening as someone stepped out, looking around with confusion at the growing water on the street, not yet aware of what was causing it, only that something was different. I stayed where I was, letting the rain soak through, listening to the system as it transitioned from control to release. This was not a failure in the way most people think of it. It was a response, the only response left available to a network that had been forced into imbalance. And as I stood there, watching the water rise just enough to reflect the uncertainty now spreading through the neighborhood, I knew there was no stopping what came next, because nothing about this moment was accidental. It was the result of everything that had been done, building layer by layer, pressure by pressure, until the system simply followed the path it had been left with. The shift from warning to consequence did not announce itself with noise. It revealed itself through accumulation, through the way everything that had been building finally stopped hiding beneath the surface. By the time the rain had been falling for several hours, the streets no longer looked like controlled drainage paths. They looked like holding areas, thin sheets of water stretching wider across the pavement, refusing to clear at the rate they should have. I stood near the same intersection, watching as the nearest storm drain struggled under the constant input, water swirling at its edges instead of being pulled cleanly downward, the pattern irregular now, disrupted by pressure moving in directions it was never meant to. The smell had changed too, no longer faint, no longer something that could be dismissed. It hung in the air, heavy and persistent, mixing with the scent of rain and asphalt in a way that made people stop and look around, trying to understand what they were sensing without knowing where it was coming from. A porch light flicked on across the street, then another, doors opening as residents stepped out onto their driveways, some holding umbrellas, others just standing under the overhangs, watching the water gather where it had never gathered before. Confusion moved through them quietly, the same way the system had been changing beneath their feet, not sudden, not loud, just undeniable once it reached a certain point. I saw Margaret step out from her front door, her posture still composed, but her movements sharper now, quicker, as she walked toward the curb and looked down at the water pooling along the street. She said something to one of the neighbors. Her voice carried faintly through the rain, controlled but edged with something new, something that had not been there before. Uncertainty. That was the moment the perception of control began to shift. Not because of anything dramatic, but because the system was no longer responding the way it was supposed to, and that kind of deviation cannot be managed with authority or paperwork. It has to be understood, and understanding was the one thing that had been missing from the start. The first rail release came subtly, a change in movement near one of the manholes where the water suddenly lifted slightly before settling back, a sign that pressure had found a point of resistance and was beginning to push against it. It did not break through all at once. It tested, adjusted, pressed again, each cycle building on the last. I watched as the water around it grew darker, the surface no longer uniform, small disturbances forming and spreading outward, patterns that did not belong to simple rainfall. A few residents stepped back instinctively, not because they knew exactly what was happening, but because something about it felt wrong, felt different from anything they had experienced before. Margaret moved closer, then stopped, her eyes fixed on the shifting surface, and for the first time since I had met her, she was not directing anything, not instructing, not correcting, just watching. The system had moved beyond the point where it could be managed externally. It was responding internally, following the only path left available to it. More water continued to feed into it from every direction, every rooftop, every drain, every household contributing to the same network that could no longer distribute the load the way it once had. The pressure built in cycles now, rising, settling, rising again, each time pushing closer to release. And then, without any dramatic break, without any sudden force, it began to surface, not violently, but steadily, the kind of response that comes from sustained pressure finally finding space to move. The reaction from the neighborhood was immediate but contained, people stepping back, voices rising in confusion, phones appearing as they tried to capture or report what they were seeing, all of it happening above a system that had already completed its transition from control to consequence. I did not move closer, did not step in, because there was nothing to intervene in. This was not an event that could be stopped in the moment. It was the result of every decision that had led to this exact condition, unfolding in real time, exactly as it had been set up to do. And as I stood there in the rain, watching the surface finally reflect what had been building underneath all along, I understood that this was not chaos. It was structure revealing itself. By the time the rain eased into a steady drizzle, the neighborhood no longer felt like something newly built. It felt exposed, like the surface had finally stopped pretending to be in control. The water had settled into places it was never designed to remain. Thin reflective layers stretching across the streets, pooling near curbs, lingering around the drains that now carried more than they were ever meant to handle. The air held that heavy, sour edge without apology, no longer subtle, no longer ignorable, and you could see it in the way people moved, slower, more cautious, stepping around areas they did not fully understand but instinctively avoided. I stood at the edge of it all, not inside the subdivision, not outside it either, just far enough to observe without interfering, watching the system complete what it had already started. Emergency vehicles arrived quietly, not with urgency but with procedure, flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement in distorted streaks, officials stepping out with measured movements, assessing, documenting, trying to understand something that could not be solved from the surface alone. I saw one of them kneel near a drain, lifting the grate carefully, his expression shifting as he looked inside, not surprised, but not comfortable either, because what he was seeing did not match the assumptions the design had been built on. Conversations started forming in small groups, voices low but tense, neighbors comparing what they were noticing, how long the smell had been there, when the water had started behaving differently, all of them piecing together fragments of a system they had never been shown in full. Margaret stood near the center of it, still composed in posture, but the certainty that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, the realization that control on paper does not extend below ground. She spoke with the officials, gesturing toward the streets, toward the drains, toward anything visible. But I could tell by the way they responded that the focus had already shifted elsewhere, beneath the surface, into the part of the system she had never accounted for. The investigation would not take long, not because it was simple, but because the structure was clear to anyone who understood it. Load without recalculation. Access sealed without alternative. Control point removed without replacement. It was all there, not hidden, just ignored until it could no longer be. I turned away before anything was said directly to me, not because I needed to avoid it, but because there was nothing left to explain. The system had already done that. Over the next few days, the changes were immediate but methodical. Sections of pavement were marked, then opened, the clean lines of the subdivision broken apart to reach what had been buried without understanding. Equipment returned, not to build this time, but to correct, to relieve pressure, to re-establish the balance that had been disrupted. The smell faded gradually as the system was given space to function again. The water cleared. The surface returned to the controlled appearance it had before, but the difference was not in how it looked, it was in how it was understood. I came back one morning as the work crews finished sealing a newly installed access point, properly placed this time, correctly measured, designed with the system in mind rather than over it. The air was clean again, the streets dry, the neighborhood quiet, but it felt different, not because anything dramatic remained, but because the illusion was gone. Margaret stood at a distance, watching the final steps, her posture still upright, but no longer directive, no longer certain. She glanced in my direction briefly, not with hostility, not with acknowledgement, just with the kind of recognition that comes when reality replaces assumption. I did not say anything, did not need to, because in the end, nothing I could have explained would have carried the same weight as what had already happened. I got back into my truck, the familiar sound of gravel under the tires grounding everything back into something simple, something real, and as I drove away, I thought about what my father used to say, that systems do not punish, they respond. They follow the rules they were built on, whether people understand them or not. And this time, all I did was let it.